Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'll be your host today, and we're going to be talking about leveraging resources and validating game concepts. So, indie game development is a constant balancing act, especially when it comes to deciding where to invest our most important resources, time and money. So, today we'll explore the relationship we have with these resources, find creative ways to increase them, and how we should use them. But we don't stop there, as we'll discuss the role they play and how we validate concepts, going over everything from crowdfunding to one of the simplest and most effective ideas ever to validate a concept, and it requires very little time and money and will save you a ton of both too. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back, and today with us I have a familiar face. Well, I'll say voice. Neil Edwards. Neil Edwards is back on the show with us. How's it going, man?
It's going really good, really good. I'm super glad as always to be back and have another fun kind of riff session and dive into some ideas that have been you and I have been personally chatting about like we often do kind of in the background. So yeah, it's things are good.
Yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, like you said, you've been here before. Neil's becoming a familiar voice here.
I think it's I think it's my third time, I think.
It is, and for quick reference, folks, he was on episode 299 where we were talking about aligning your marketing and games UX. That was a fun one. And then, we had another one, 320, creating share-worthy game moments. And not only that, I mean, you know, some people, some listeners actually reached out and said, "Wow, I really like the conversations with Neil." I mean, they like a lot of the guests that we have here on the show, but you've been one of the few names that have been popped up. So it's always a pleasure to have you on. Just not just because we're friends, but because it just works really well. And plus, like you said, we talk in the background. We have lots of things that we like to talk about and everything. And sometimes we think it's important to kind of like make the community aware of it. So
Yeah, I super appreciate that. I'm so glad that people find it useful. It's a fun extension for me, I think, and for you that helps us kind of like harden and refine our own ideas, stuff that we're learning kind of in our current, dev business lives and kind of like it's a cool way to maybe help share some knowledge, but also like really, I think helps sharpen us as well.
yeah,
And it's just always a fun riff session. So super, super glad to be back and glad people are enjoying it.
yeah, same here. So with that said, just really quick introductions, and plus, highly recommend you go back to those episodes. We'll throw them in the show notes too. But Neil, he's a co-founder of Ludivore Games, and previously, founder of former head
UX
of
is fine.
yeah, what yeah, UX is fine. That's right. But you can get all the other stuff too, and everything that he's done in the past. But I mean, I want to know now, or have you share a little bit more about Ludivore Games, because that's where a lot of cool and exciting things are happening currently with you. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So about a year and a half ago ish, I left um, my spot as one of the co-founders and the head of UX at UX is fine after like 5 really strong years there to start doing board games full time. So now I've made the shift from digital games. Now we make board games. I do it full time. My business partner and dear friend Luke, he does it part time with me. We're the co-founders and owners and sort of like designers, co-creative directors, we do all kind of the design stuff and everything behind the scenes. So yeah, we've launched our first game, which is kind of a cozy, quick, approachable 2-player strategy game about growing these tiny forests called aspens. We launched that back in September, October of last year. It did really well on Kickstarter, especially for sort of a debut game. We are well into the thick of fulfilling that. We're starting to get into the art of our next game, which is like a very different, much more involved sort of action-packed, push your luck co-op game that we're really excited about. So yeah, it's been a huge, really fun, really challenging learning journey of just next level sort of not just game dev, but entrepreneurism. We're basically 1.25 people. So some days I'm pinching pennies and spreadsheets over manufacturing quotes. Some days I'm doing game design. Some days I'm doing art direction. kind of all over the place.
Yeah,
And
that's how it
and
is.
so it kind of brings us to our topic today, and a lot of the topics we talked about previously, they're all kind of connective. It's like a lot of the crossover of business, games as a business, right? And
Yeah.
thinking about all those ends of how not to just make a great game, but how to sell a game. And so that's a lot of what, our talks end up being about and bring us to these kind of interesting conversations on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize. Maybe I didn't hear it, but these games in particular you were just sharing and working on and everything, they're primarily board games. And again, I can't remember if you said that or not, but just for additional context for people listening, if but you probably did. And I'm the one who's just like, as I said
It's
before
my
this.
silky it's my silky smooth voice lulling you to sleep, Andrew. I think I did mention it, but yeah, we are 100% board games.
It's okay. You can call
Um,
me out on it. It's been a crazy week. So all right.
no, you're good. It's a Friday. It's a Friday for sure.
Yes, it is what we're recorded as. All right, cool. So yeah, exactly. This brings us here to what we're talking about. And hey, you know what? Let's not waste any time. Let's get into it. But because it's been a while, I am gonna have you go through the cue box round. All right. So
All right.
I'm not gonna go through the quick spiel, other than we're just gonna go kind of quick, rapid fire, and then we can chat. So here we go. Cue box round. Question one: Name one thing that motivates you every day.
I think for me, it sounds cheesy, but I'm really blessed and it's really true. I love what I do. It doesn't mean it's always fun. It doesn't mean I mean, there's days I wake up, I'm like, oh God, I don't want to go to work just like everybody else. But there's never a day that I would choose to be doing something different. Very blessed and fortunate to be able to say that. And I think there's two main reasons, which is one, working in a tiny company, being able to like really push your vision or your small collective vision with a couple stakeholders forward and kind of see the impact to be able to shape something that's kind of like fully your own
Mm,
and see your kind of fingerprints on something and bring a vision fully to life from end to end, from concept to in people's hands and homes. It's just so rewarding. And then honestly, I love the variety of it. Like I mentioned a moment ago, I mean, some days I'm in financial spreadsheets, some days I'm on social media, some days I'm doing art direction, which I'm totally not qualified to do, but it's a fun challenge. So those are the things I think that really keep me motivated.
love it. All right. Next is, what's one habit you do to keep a clear and healthy mind?
I think the big thing for me, and you can definitely tell like sort of how I'm doing, whether I'm doing these things or not, is like just like taking like multiple like scheduled like small meditation breaks throughout the day. Like when I'm really on top of my stuff, I take like 3 to 4 breaks to like meditate just for 5 to 10 minutes a day. There's lots of times when I'm not doing that, and it's usually when I feel a lot more chaotic and sort of maybe not as calm and sort of peace of mind. And then the other thing too, I think is really important for devs, anyone that's like a vision holder or like driving anything, but even just like whoever, making time to take long walks and like just let your mind wander and decompress and kind of daydream, especially when you think about strategy, like as a business owner, like strategy is a lot about like making way for things to appear to you that you don't normally see. You don't know what you don't know. And so just taking time for long walks really, I think, has led to some important epiphanies or realizations for us as a business throughout the years.
Yeah. I want to say quick. I love that you called out to this because it's funny. It even recently it aligns with like things that I've been practicing, which is super helpful. Not necessarily meditation, though. I kind of do want to try that, but I'm making it a point where I'm trying to, whether I'm doing a task, especially if it's like maybe an hour or a little bit over that. And then at the end of it, before I start a new thing, I get up, I walk around, maybe I'll get the mail, maybe I'll walk around my neighborhood or whatever. But then I come back and do it again. And it's like very similar process. I've been reading a lot of stuff and it keeps like surfacing. I'm like, I'm gonna try it. And it has worked wonders to the point where I feel like I can push myself a little bit more with some of the
Yeah.
work I'm doing and productivity. But then it's like because I've noticed in the past, if I just keep pushing all through the day, the next thing you know, I'm like, oh, I need a longer break, and I'm taking like a 2 hour break, which like or
Also the
and it's harder to
quality.
get back into it too.
Yeah. And the quality of your work goes down too. Like
Oh
there's just,
yeah,
whether it's meditation, whether it's a walk, I don't really care. I think it's mental breaks
yeah.
and just like letting your, like getting out of the executive function of your brain. There's actually like clinical research. I
Oh yeah,
read a
there
book one
is.
time that shows, they call it like the daydream mode, and it going into it actually like recharges your executive function mode and your ability to really task focus and things like that. So I'm a big believer in that. Like I said, I don't always do it enough.
Yeah.
But when I do, my work is better, my life is better. I'm more at peace. I'm more, just everything is better. So yeah,
Yeah.
big plus one.
Yeah, totally. Sweet. All right, last but not least, and the staple here on the show is what game are you playing now?
I think the thing I've played most recently is Lonely Mountain Snow Riders, which is the sequel to the wonderful Lonely Mountains Downhills, which is actually a game by some really good friends of ours out of Germany. And it is like this really killer. There's not really games out there like it. It's this. I mean, basically, it's a downhill skiing game. The first one's downhill mountain biking, which I know you'll resonate with, Andrew. Um, but it's this really great like mix of like race/time trial, but with this very reminiscent of 90s game, sort of like puzzly exploration where like,
Huh.
can I go in this route? Like the developers, and is this jump possible? And so it has this really rich, and then the level design is brilliantly crafted. It's extremely impressive, but it just makes for such a zen mixed with mastery, mixed with like puzzle exploration. I mean, I can sit there and just kind of get immersed in it and just have a couple hours disappear. And the controls, like, it's just really chef's kiss how tight the controls are. So, yeah, I've been enjoying that a lot lately.
Sweet. Yeah, that does sound nice. I'll have to check that out because not that I really make the time for games as much as I should be, but that sounds relaxing. So
That's the one that's been able to sneak into my life lately because I'm guiltily the same, especially with digital games these days, is not I don't play as much as I should.
yeah.
But that one's definitely been able to make it into the busy life schedule.
Yeah, sweet. Well, hey man, thanks for sharing all that. Really good stuff there. And now, as promised, we are going to get right to the conversation, folks. And as I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about some really important things here, specifically leveraging resources and validating game concepts. And you know what? This is, I know for you and I, Neil, this has been really like, top of mind
Yeah.
between like what we're doing in our own businesses, probably what we see in the industry and in various other areas. And time again, it's like, we were talking offline earlier, which prompted all this. We're like, why isn't more people talking or thinking about this in terms of like resources and what they actually are and how we're interpreting them? So let's
Yeah.
kick this off then, because there's a lot that we want to probably get into here. And let's kick it off with, just identifying some things like what are some of the common mistakes you see developers make when trying to manage their resources effectively?
Yeah. So I think to me, one of the big things is like risk and not understanding sort of risk as a resource and risk mitigation and how it plays into things and kind of viewing like time and money like two separately. I think a lot of times, like as indie devs, we view sort of like, okay, well, maybe say I'm self funded, right? And I'm kind of funding myself. Maybe I'm working part time, maybe I'm not working at all. And so I'm kind of living off savings and things like that. A lot of times we look at that pool of money that we have to like kind of live and we're like, okay, well, I have lots of time. What I don't have much of is money. And that can be very true in certain situations. It can absolutely be very true. But those things are just functions of each other. And so not seeing that as clearly of like, and we'll get into this more. I think all these questions are so connected. I don't want to kind of give too much ahead of kind of the answers we'll get into and topics, but the cold hard truth of it is like if you spend too much time making the wrong thing, meaning something that's exceedingly difficult to sell, it doesn't have a hook, people don't want it, you don't know how to communicate about it. If you spend 3, 6, 9, 12 months making a game that ultimately doesn't sell, you don't know how to sell, that that's a lot of resources down the drain, and your time is not renewable. It's not free. And so oftentimes we think about that not as much of when we're pinched on one resource, we tend to overvalue it, right? And so we're like, hey, I don't have a lot of money. I can't spend, even this little bit of money because I just don't have it. And it's just like, okay, well, if you assign more money value to your time, which you should, there's some potentially catastrophic waste and loss there of like going, 6 months down the path, 9 months, and then making something you can't sell versus spending a couple $1,000s maybe to try to validate that. And I get that I'm speaking loosely here. Everyone has different, financial realities and things like that. But I think you got to draw a triangle of like the bigger picture between like time, money, and risk. And like understand that formula of it's all about what your goals are. And basically, it's the odds of you getting the return on your investment, both in forms of time and money that you need, and understanding, where are your levers hard locked versus you just think they're hard locked, but you could maybe trade some time for some money or things like that. Um, and then I think the other big common mistake, which kind of I guess I already alluded to a little bit, is this may be just viewed as development, but to me, it is about managing resources. It's like if if you're going to go down a path and commit to a path, you really want to do the best you can to validate as early and as cost effectively as possible that that is a viable path to achieve your goals, whatever your business outcomes are that you need to be happy with. Some people just want to put a game out. Some people want to be financially sustainable so they can make a next game. Some people want to hit it big. Some people have investors. They need, everyone's goals are different, but validating those early. And I think a lot of times, I know I'm going long here, but just wrap that into one last thought. I see myself many times throughout my career, many studios, things like that. We sometimes start like on the third or fourth step instead of the first step. And that is like, okay, man, we've got an idea. Everyone's ripped about it. This is my passion indie project, whether it's, this could be a AAA scenario, indie, whatever, single person, 20 people. There's a lot of starting at, okay, we're super ripped on this idea. And now we have this subconscious mindset that it's about the process now is about making that game or how to make that game, but that is the game we're making, right? So we're going to make a Metroidvania hand drawn with Greek mythology and super tight combat. We've already decided in the back of our head that's what we're excited about. So then all of our decisions and all of our mind space is about, okay, what's the best way to make that game? And we're already about 4 or 5 steps ahead when we have to start earlier and more rigorously, like, what game should we be making, right?
Yeah.
Should being defined as meets our goals, give us the best chance of success. So I'd say those are the biggest, most common mistakes I see people that end up in resource issues.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you brought up some really good points there. I'm sure we're going to dive in a little bit further, but like the ones I made quick notes of here is like validate or having that validation process. And one I've been talking a lot with like clients and others is just like, having that checks and balances, right? And we'll probably go into that a little bit later. And the other thing too, when we were talking about resources, I mean, essentially what you were saying from what I interpret is it's really about like having a better understanding of the relationship and understanding of resources in different contexts in different ways because
Yeah,
I mean if you think about it, like a lot of the reason how we think about resources are habits, are patterns or behaviors that we might have uh, I mean, I know we're getting psychological stuff, but it could be referenced from how you were raised as a kid or something. It could
absolutely.
like your environment, like, look, think of like parents that grew up in the 50s that were kids, right? Like everybody had to eat everything off their plate. Like
Yeah,
it was that mentality, right? And that could explain the reasons and why you do things or you look at things a certain way because there's those factors. And then another thing from a psychology perspective, and I don't have anything to support or back this, folks. It's just vague memories of things that I've seen. But when you were talking about pinched resources, I think there's something there too about like a human component where there were some studies doing where like if you have a jar filled with like, I don't know, some kind of candy you like, right? And you have a big jar and it's completely filled. And then you have someone else who has like another jar and it only has a few pieces. I think in both scenarios, like the person with the big jar, they'll go all the way down like to town on that, like, oh, I have excess. Great. And then once they get close to the bottom, they get slower and slower to the point where I think are the ones that aren't even eating as much as the people that have like that started off with nothing.
it's scarce. It's the principle of scarcity, right? Like
Yeah.
in not always, but in general, the more scarce a resource it is, the more precious and valuable it is to people, and the more they tend to hoard it or be careful about using it. There's also the whole kind of game design theory element as well of like loss aversion, right? Where
Mhm.
like people will work so much harder to like avoid a loss.
Right, because it's like
Um,
pain.
and then sort of that the fear of like losing resources is like more than the potential excitement of like gaining resources. I'm gonna butcher the way that's actually, but that's the gist of it, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
gist of it is like there's an outsized effect of like the desire to avert a loss,
Right.
and that's where a lot of kind of short-sightedness can come from of like, well, what if we spend these $3,000 on this ad campaign and like, you know, tells us like we're making the wrong thing or like we don't learn anything from it, like that will just be a huge waste. And I think it's a bias towards like what people can see and grab a hold of right now versus the future of like, oh, well, what if we don't spend those $3,000? We don't learn something critical. And then we spend 9 months, which is tens of thousands
Yeah,
of dollars
yeah.
worth of money making the wrong thing. Right. And don't get me wrong, it's hard to stay disciplined to that stuff. So it's not like I'm preaching from the pulpit of like, hey, you know, dummies, just do this. It's very difficult
Yeah.
to stay true to this stuff, even for us. That's why we like to talk about it because it helps us come back to these good lessons to to try to do the best we can for our business as we go and things get crazy in development, you know?
Yeah. And, it's no different than what you were talking about earlier in terms of one of those habits, like talking about these things, kind of like stepping back out from it a little bit, like getting that, eagle eye view is what helps us with this. So,
Yeah.
as we were talking about those things, let's talk about it more, especially like, time and money. These are the biggest resources I'd say that we really, really, that it boiled down to and what we have. So, in that, how would you say that indie developers can maximize efficiency when they have more time than money? Because I'm sure that potentially could be a lot of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm gonna cheat a little bit here and my first point will be bouncing back to the first question is like I would challenge you to like look hard at what you really do have. And if you can open up some of those relationships, I think a lot of times, myself included, there is times on Aspens where I was like, oh man, we don't really have this money to spend. But it was more about like I was afraid that it would be wasted and we did have a limited amount of money to spend. And so there was like the actual resource, and then there was like my perception of the resource and sort of looking at like, well, if we don't spend this money and risk it now, the other risk is could be much bigger. So I would challenge you to really look hard at your resources and see if you can actually move some from one, something from one pool to another. Is there a way that you can free up some money? Do you maybe have more money than and you don't need a lot of money to do some of this stuff. So I would challenge you first. And then I think the other maybe more potentially helpful non-cheating answer is like you have to figure out how to get scrappy and you have to, I would say like look at that triangle again of like risk, what are your goals? How much money do you have? How much time do you have? What of those things are, you know, what balls are rubber, what balls are glass, right? And so, and identify the things, in a process that you really feel are important. And then if you don't have the money, so for example, like running ads to a landing page to try to validate a game idea, which we will talk about a bunch more later, there's very little true way to do that without money. You kind of just need money. But that said, you have to start to get scrappy if you truly don't have the money. But I think a lot of times we throw things out in our head. We're like, well, we don't have $5,000 or even $1,000 to run an ad campaign. So in our mind, we go, okay, well, we're just not going to do that. Right. I would urge people, don't go that far. Don't say, okay, we can't do it because we don't have the money. Ask yourselves what would the outcome, what's the format of that? So okay, so we're trying to validate the game idea by getting people to go to a website and see if they put in their landing page. Okay, well, is there a guerrilla grassroots way that you could achieve that, right? I think what I'm slowly trying to get at is it's better to get a 10 to 20 to 30% version of something that you kind of hack together, assuming it doesn't give you bad data, but that's a totally different conversation. It's better to get 30% of something than to just say, oh, well, due to our resources, we can't do this. So we're just not going to do it at all. So we get 0% of that
Right.
information
Yeah.
and we do 0% of that step. So I guess to sum it up, I'd say, is there a scrappy way that you could do part of what needs to be done? And also like look at deals. Like I was talking to someone about this the other day, you know, you may not have money for an artist or something, right? Is there people that would be willing to work on profit share, right? You have to look at what you can trade, barter, whatever, to get creative with your resources. And I think it's all about opening your mind because sometimes we're like, oh, that's just not for us. We can't do it. And I think there's a lot more possibilities than sometimes we realize.
Yeah, and what I think a lot of what we were just talking about there and what you were sharing, it really comes down to looking at things in two different ways. Whether you have an abundancy mindset or a scarcity mindset, and we kind of like talked about the scarcity one at least a very simple example earlier. But the difference in that I'd say looking at things is like the outlook and what does that and provide because when you're talking about being scrappy and stuff, I would say a big component of that too is in order to get really scrappy, it's not necessarily just like, oh, live within your means or next to nothing type situation. It's more of like, hey, let's get creative. Because it's like, here's the funny thing, because I think that this plays on two things here. There can be a lot like it's almost like I think there's some scientific proof behind this too or whatever, more psychology stuff, but through limitations you can actually be a lot more creative. But you have to come in with that mindset of knowing like, hey, asking like, how else can I do this? What else is there out there, instead of saying I can't, because those create those limiting beliefs and everything else, and it creates more of a scarcity mindset saying like you can't do these things, it's limiting. But in those limitations, I mean, think about it. When you're talking about being scrappy, and think of you come up with this really creative way of like, putting something together that is generating all of a sudden like all sorts of results, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have thought of any other way if you had all the money. You're like, oh, we'll just throw this at this because we can do it now. And let's say it was some agency and they didn't understand everything or things weren't communicated and that went to crap. It's like, well, okay, there's any number of scenarios
Yeah.
where things like that do and can happen. Nothing against agencies, but just that was just a random example, but still.
Absolutely, and just to double down on that, when to clarify, just to put another point on that. When I said get scrappy, I didn't mean like live on less. Like what I'm talking about is like you said, get creative. So like in a perfect world, you'd maybe spend a few $1,000s on a Facebook ad campaign to a landing page for your concept to help validate. Okay, you don't have a few $1,000s. Okay. Can you spend 50 bucks making, and these all may be terrible ideas, but this is what I'm talking about. Like, can you make QR codes and take them to like, local spot that would somehow, have maybe your target audience in it and try to get more people? Do you know a friend that has maybe a small time Twitter following of maybe a few thousand people? Can they post a link to your game concept or whatever? Like, it's just about like how do you in a creative way try to, you know, have a yes mindset instead of a oh we can't do this mindset to at least achieve a fraction of the outcome of whatever step in the dev process, which today happens to be focused on validating concepts that you can achieve with your limited resources. For example, like we did posts on Reddit to get play testers and it like local tech groups. And like it was grueling and it was annoying. And it was like, it was very time consuming. Maybe it wasn't even a great use of time, but it was the only way that we knew how to get play testers. And eventually we built like a huge playtest sort of like following and like rapport. And we did a lot of like brute force work of like going out and testing in cafes. And for example, we spent a lot of our time, not a lot of money, um, because, not for a limited resources in that scenario, but that was like the only way we could figure out to achieve that goal. But we had to go about it our own way that worked for us, because, we couldn't necessarily pay, actually was a limited resources. We couldn't pay tens of thousands of dollars to have the game play tested by these play testing companies. So we did it ourselves and we used our abundance of time to just do it ourselves, so that's kind of what I'm talking.
Yeah, yeah, and you know what? It's also a constant assessment. I mean, a self assessment, things like that, to really kind of determine that, and then as you move forward and get momentum, you start realizing where, well, as long as you have that understanding, because like we've called out to before, you know, time is one of the most limited resources out there. It's not as much as money as we might think, and that's part of that understanding a relationship. But at a certain time, you're going to figure out when to kind of balance those things and when is it more important, because if it's always you doing everything, and like the example you're saying before, like, when it comes to scaling and things like this and being smart of it, but like, 30%, 50%, 80% of something is better than like 100% of you doing it possibly in some
Absolutely.
scenarios,
And
which was getting you 0% growth or progression or whatever.
and I think we'll probably come back to this, but this is a really good riff that reminded me, right? We're talking about being short on time, but at some point, if you have some success, that equation flips, like you're saying,
Yeah.
Andrew. And that's something I've really, honestly, I've historically not been very good at. And I think this is a really important thing, especially as indie types. You have to realize when maybe you've got a little money to work with to not necessarily scrounge and save every penny, but look at, okay, if I spent a few $1,000s here, how much of my time could that free up of me doing everything? How much could that increase the quality? Maybe I'm not the best graphic designer, so we could get better quality by paying someone. That's something that I've historically and even very recently really had to like lean into trying to grow in that area to honestly just avoid burnout. And a lot of it is like really taking the time to like look at like, okay, what could I offload? How much would it cost? Is it worth it? But like taking the time to at least ask those questions versus being clamped down of like so scarcity mindset of like, man, we've got to save as much money as we can. Because the truth is, and I know this is kind of maybe a privileged position or mindset, because we have had a little bit of success, but it was a long journey. I mean, for context, like I didn't take a paycheck for like 16 months leading up to this game, and we put a lot into it and took a lot of risk. And so it can take time to like change these mindsets. But now I lost my train of thought. But anyway, it's important to recognize when you can kind of make some of those resource trades and not be in old mindsets and old habits and free yourself up. And oh, that's what I was going to say. When we don't have a lot of money, it feels like the most precious kind of resource in the world. But the truth is, money is a renewable resource and time is not.
Yeah.
If you spend 9 months making the wrong thing, you cannot get those 9 months back. You can make more money, but you can never make more time. And I know that sounds like foo-foo spiritual, but it actually has a lot of business implications as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And man, it's so funny, and I don't want to go on a tangent here, but just one thing that came up too is like these types of relationships. You'll start seeing them everywhere else. Like another capacity too is if people are asking for like equity in their studio or whatever versus other means. But
Yeah,
and while it's not necessarily similar resources, but still it is a resource. But sometimes what happens if people are like giving up all this equity, they might not even have much to offer and they get it next to nothing. Or but let's say you're agreeing to these things, right? Next thing you know, you're walking around with all this baggage. And if you're not doing these validation points and everything else and not getting there, that's like now you have this hanging over you. And then you can't get forward because you didn't properly maybe look at what potential outcomes could have been, or the risk associated with giving up so much equity to, let's say, multiple partners and
yeah,
things like that. So this is very dynamic. Like the money time thing has like it relates to a lot of other things that we see in the industry and how you
yeah,
operate your business and
yeah.
everything else. So
And I will say, I swear this is the only one last thing, and I said one last thing 3 times. But something that came into my mind recently, like I mean, a little bit of background context, like I've wanted to make my own games and kind of like do the quote unquote indie thing my whole career. And, it's taken me like what 12, 13, I don't know, 13 years to get there. And one thing when you haven't quote unquote achieved that dream or whatever, which is a whole other sort of Oprah, but you want it so bad that you sometimes you fool yourself into thinking like, oh, going back to a day job or working part-time is like a failure or you're like giving up. And it's like, I couldn't disagree with that mindset more. And like one way to like balance your resources and like maximize efficiency is like trade some of your time to get some money. If you need
yeah,
some money to do something in your game and like maybe you're like a moonlighter or maybe you're a full-time self-funded person with limited resources, like can you find like a part-time, design job or coding job or whatever? Can you go work 6 months for a contract and take a break and like build up those resources and not looking at everything so black and white of like, if I'm not doing the indie dream, I'm failing, and it's just
yeah,
like, well,
yeah,
sometimes you got to like, again, get scrappy, maybe you go work for a bit or like I said, work part-time. to get some of those resources that you need for your game that you don't otherwise have. And I would encourage people to like look at their ultimate goals and be gracious with themselves that like it's not a if it helps you make your game, it's not a betrayal of the dream at all. It's how you achieve sustainability and get to the ultimate goal you're looking for. So again, think outside the box, look for other opportunities.
Yeah, and I'm glad you called that out too, because sometimes I even have that moment where, or at least in the past, where I'll be like, "Hey, if for whatever reason like something didn't work out, like what would I do?" I'm like, "Well, I'd shift gears." I like it's there's times I would. I could never do this now because it wouldn't be even worth my time. But I'm like, hey, if I ever had to, I'd just go down to the local grocery store, get a job until
Yeah,
I got on my feet again. But now I'm like, that would be destroying so much time because of the rate a grocery store would pay versus what I'm accustomed and know that I'm capable of doing now. That scenario has shifted, but maybe like 5 years ago I would have totally jumped at that, and then until something else and gets me to
yeah,
the next thing, and that's kind of how it plays out. But yeah, that mindset helps out a lot, because then at least it's like, hey, if crap hits the fan, at least I know what to do. I'm gonna get on top of it. It's gonna suck, but
yeah,
hey, I'll just pony up and keep riding until I can figure out the next thing that gets me to that dream and everything else. You know,
yeah. Because the key thing there is quitting and stopping aren't the same thing. Stopping is temporary. Quitting is forever, right?
yeah,
And so it's
yep,
like if you have to stop doing what you're doing for some amount of time to then come back to it, there's nothing wrong with that. It's totally different. But what you will do is work yourself into an insane burnout if you're in this pressure cooker of like, I can't ever let up. And then you'll probably end up quitting
yeah,
for good because you've made it so miserable, right? So like just having that grace to understand that this is a challenging and dynamic life being a quote unquote indie dev. And there's no one right way to be an indie dev,
yeah.
right?
No, there isn't. It's not that intuitive. I wish it were. Before we talk about validation, because we need to get into discuss that a little bit more. I mean, in light of everything we just talked about, are there any like tools, methods, things that we can kind of like track, help us optimize the resources that we're using while we're making games?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have like quote unquote tools or maybe like formal methods, but to me, like the most simple thing is like make projections. And
Mm,
again, your response to this can't be like, well, I'm not a financial person. I don't know how to make projections. Like all of this is like common sense. And it's like 50% of a 50% quality projection is better than a good honest one is better than 0% and not doing it and saying like, well, I just don't know how to do that. So it's like simple, like to really get specific. It's like, okay, well, what are your goals? Right. So like I'll use a very specific example. We spent like 16 months making the game. That meant that I had spent X thousands of dollars supporting myself. Living expenses, Luke and I had each put in X tens of thousands of dollars into the games. So we were in it for this much, right? So we needed to at least get that back. And we kind of had different success scenarios defined. Okay, break even. Okay, da da da. Ultimately, our goal was sustainability, right? So our goal was we need to make back everything we put into it, cash and my living expenses, because that was money that I had spent on the game, even though that I didn't spend it on the game. So another important thing to think about.
mhm.
And then we wanted to make, we each kind of had our own, we had a kind of profit share deal worked up, and we had our own kind of you know, how much additional runway do we want out of this to see this as a success? Because our goal was sustainability. Our goal was we want to have not just make everything back, but give us padding to make game number two.
Mhm.
So that gave us a number. So like X, in this case, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And so then we looked at, okay, what's our average price point? What's our base price point? What did we think our average pledge tier is going to be? This is all based on research. So we're looking at other campaigns. What are their average pledge tier, average backer counts for games like ours? So then we start to back that into, okay, how many copies do we need to sell? And then we start to look at, okay, how realistic is that? How many games like ours or studios like ours that maybe don't have IP or a big franchise? How many people out there, what percentage are achieving this level of success? Do we look like we have to be an average level of success? Do we look like we have to be like an outsized fucking lunar shooting star, like one in a million type success? And that's part of why we made a board game and why we went to Kickstarter, because we looked at the odds of success on Kickstarter as a platform. way higher than Steam, way fucking higher. The potential ceiling, much lower, right? You're not going to make a game that makes $5 million, $10 million on Kickstarter. You're just not. Some people do, but it's unbelievably rare. But the floor, a reasonable amount of achievable kind of success you could presume, given, factors go your way, was solid and it would meet our goal. And we realized this is a very achievable thing for us. So I would encourage people, if there's one thing you do for tracking and optimizing resources, first make these projections to paint a scenario for yourself. Be honest with yourself and say, okay, is this doable? Because if it's not, you got to find a different formula. Is your price point too low? Are you in too competitive of a genre? Like look at the data. A lot of this, it doesn't take a data science degree to at least come up with like a humble, like grassroots, I'm not a fucking genius by I'm not even that smart. But it's about looking at the data and being honest with yourself. So I would say projections are really important in terms of, and with those rolling up like any key factors, right?
Mhm.
What's our runway? When are we going to run out of money? How close are we willing to get to that number before we are really uncomfortable emotionally with the number in our
Yeah.
bank account? That was something we did really poorly. The game, we didn't know how much the game was going to cost us. It cost us way more than we thought. And so now the second game will be much more prepared because we're going to update our projections. We did the best we could, but our projections weren't great on that front the first time around. And things got pretty trim towards the end. And like, it was a little nail biting for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And as you were talking about with projections, like one thing that came to mind, and I don't know, you could take it for what it's worth, folks, but I'm like, you know what? Maybe a good exercise, and I think not too long ago, I actually recommended this to someone too. You know, in a way, if you look at, let's say most pitch decks to publishers, right? And I know some of the sentiment, I can't say completely, but from what I've been hearing and talking around, it's like people knowing that it's a very difficult landscape and very minimal opportunities there on the publishing space, even though more still pop up here and there. Going through the exercise of like, if you were to pitch to a publisher, whether you have no intention of doing so or not, that process does a lot of good things, and part of it is actually in a very simple way making projections like, okay, and the ones that I see that I think are really good, and I've seen some where when they do a good job at making projections and outlining like, hey, project one will take this long and make about a goal of making about this much money, project two, project three, those are really really well defined, and those also establish your goals and everything else, and it gives you a lot more to work with and work back from than if you're just like, oh, I have this goal, we're going to make this commercial product, this game, and they get a lot more dialed in. And not only that, on the more of a marketing side of things, if you're putting together some type of a pitch deck, what you're ultimately doing is you're showing to basically how you can communicate to multiple stakeholders essentially, or people that are at least interested. So I think it's always a good exercise, and just a very simple one if you think about it, to maybe go through that. And like I said, maybe this isn't the best idea ever, but I was just thinking of it as you were sharing that.
No, absolutely. And I think that goes a lot into the next question about like kind of validation. And because
Hmm.
part of validation is pitch deck type of stuff and what's your game, what are the USPs, how do you communicate it? But the one last note I want to offer, I know we're running short on time here, is when it comes to the projections, you could even do that without a game concept
Yeah.
because you could just use broad general market type stuff. So for example, like it's extremely hard to get more than 7 or 8,000 backers on Kickstarter. Like you can change the amount of money quite a bit, but the amount of backers like, is extremely difficult without a big IP. So you can use some kind of like fixed standard kind of levels of success. But the other thing is these projections cannot just give you targets. They help establish constraints. And what I mean by that very specifically is if you say, okay, my cost of living is X thousands of dollars a month. And so for every year I spend on the game, I need to make, you know, Y more dollars. So if I spend 4 years making a game, all of a sudden it has to be 4 times as successful. And the odds of that are they're not, that's not a linear relationship. The more time you spend on a game is not increasing its odds or scale of success for the most part. And so that can help you as a studio or as a individual or as a small team say, okay, well, realistically, if we're going to achieve a reasonable level of success, we cannot spend more than 1.5 years making this game. Instantly, that rules you out of a ton of genres that you should just not even look at making
Yeah.
and so these projections can help you find what idea you should even pursue because they define how much success you need and how much money you can spend making the game.
Yeah, lots of really good stuff there. And you know, with that said and everything else, let's start to talk about some validation, concepts and things like that, because validation is really important. We talked briefly about it, and one of the things I called out is like checks and balances and things. So, and let's say in terms of how this can play, earlier on with a concept, like I'm curious, how would you say that, like, let's say things like research, play in shaping, game early concepts, or at least helping to validate them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you can call it player research. I think you can call it market research. I think you can call it you can call it whatever the hell you want. But really what it is early and cheaply, you need to
Mm,
get the idea of your game in front of people, not the game. I mean, yes, sure, get the game in front of them. But before you've even gone that far, you got to get the idea. And that forces as a forcing function for two things. One, you have to know who you're targeting, right? Because all of a sudden when you're like, "Oh, I need to go put up a landing page and run people through it and see if they're putting their email to, say, fake wish list this game," right? Immediately you're prompted with, okay, well, who am I going to send that to? What types of people? How do I find them? What are their demographics? What are their consumer traits? What other genres do they? You have to ask those things because otherwise you're like, well, I can't just send it to everyone because my data will be back horrible, right? Like, most people will not be interested in your game, right? Most people aren't interested in most games, right? It's about finding the right audience. So that's the first thing is, it helps you define your audience. And again, you do not have to be a user researcher or a career scientist to do this. You'll get pretty far with just some common sense and some very basic concepts. What are the other games they play?
hmm
Why do they play games? I mean, this is all stuff you can look up on the internet. And then the other thing is the other piece that's important to this is, like you mentioned, pitch type stuff. How do you communicate your game? You could have the coolest game ever, but if you don't know what its hooks and its USPs are on like a one sentence level, you're in trouble because my favorite saying probably in the last year is that, people don't buy your game, they buy the idea of your game, right?
Yeah.
Andrew, it's like they don't buy the steak, they buy the sizzle, right?
Yep.
And so people might say, well, no, that's not true because like if if my game gets good reviews on Steam, then people will see it has good reviews and like it will get promoted and like that's based on the quality of my game. It is. Once you get over the biggest hurdle that most indies struggle with, which is getting the first X, people to buy your game. And by X, I mean like several thousand, right? Because you need, quite a few kind of reviews, thumbs ups for any of that sort of gameplay quality to start like working in the recommendation engine of like people saying, "Hey, this game's great, gameplay's awesome." Your game will speak for itself more at that point. But
Yeah.
before you get to that point, when you are on the hardest hurdle, which is going from like, say 0 to 5 or 10,000 copies sold, that's the hardest hurdle. And at that point, people are buying the idea. They're not buying the game. So they're buying the Steam page, they're buying the tags, they're buying the screenshots, they're buying the high level description. So you got to nail those things. Um, and to me, that one of the best ways to do that is through landing page or something like it,
Yeah.
right?
And you know what? I want to add to that too, because recently I was daydreaming, if you will, about like game ideas that I've come up with myself. And sometimes in my mind, I'm like, well, okay, I know a lot of all the problems that devs and studios have when they have their own games that they're currently making, and I'm like, well, what about me? I don't have any like development skill and stuff. I'm like, I feel like I'm at a huge advantage. And then I took a step back and I'm like, wait a minute, if I could just sell this idea to X, Y, or Z person or whatever, and really convince them, and if I can't, that's just a validation point saying, okay, maybe I'm not just hitting something right, or I need a shift, or just drop this and move on to the next thing, right? But I kept telling myself, I'm like, I can see how I could totally maybe sell this in a certain way or fashion or however I'm approaching it. And it's not to say I definitively can. It's just looking at the possibility and to a degree having some level of confidence of if I approach this the right way and everything, there I would say that's a much higher possibility of selling this concept to whoever, not like a little transaction, but just to get me to the next step, the next like hurdle, the next validation point, if you will. And I think part of the problem we have sometimes is like if you look at things that way, you're gonna like again, you're gonna start becoming a little bit more creative. And personally, guys, and people listening, I feel that like with me coming up with the game idea, I feel like I'm at a much greater limitation, have greater limitation than a lot of you because I don't have like design expertise. I don't have, any development skills. The closest I know about programming is spreadsheets and Excel. Like so but still it really comes down to how you're selling, communicating, approaching these things where, that can change a whole lot. All right, another question though, Neil, is crowdfunding. Because we're talking about validation, we're talking about different steps like, pitching could be a form of it. What about crowdfunding?
Yeah.
Because lots of times you think, "Oh, if I do well, I get this money," but it's got to be more than just money. There's got to be something else more there.
It's definitely more than just money, but I think I'm gonna cheat a little bit on this question, Andrew, because I think the most valuable thing that we can talk about is like really what's at the root of crowdfunding is it's validation, but it's a little bit too far because like once you've done crowdfunding, you're committed to making the thing, right? Like if
Mm,
it succeeds, people expect you to deliver, right? And so that's it is a form of value validation, and it is done like before the whole product is built. So like you can quote unquote like save a lot that way, but it's like if you get over your funding goal, you have to deliver. But if we look more holistically at what a Kickstarter page is, it's a glorified landing page for your game, and it has a button for people to buy in, whether it's with an email or whether it's in this case actual money, to buy into your product or show buy-in, show commitment, show interest in your product before it exists, right? So if we take that back to a simpler level, I really want to talk about landing pages because like I say landing pages so much nowadays, but it's because I learned so much of what we did in the lead up to because we did a landing page to help validate Aspen's way before the Kickstarter, way before we did all that extra investment. So we basically built a page. I think it had 4 screenshots on it, 4 text blurbs, and then we spent a little bit of money running Facebook ads to it and see what kind of click through rate. And we also did this sort of $1 pre-deposit strategy, which you could also do refundable. Will you put $1 down to get a bonus goodie when the game goes live, right? And that gave us saving tens of thousands of dollars and months of effort. That gave us the confidence we needed to launch. And you don't have to be a board game. You don't have to be on Kickstarter. You can get a lot out of a few $100s on Facebook. But even if you don't have a few $100s, building a landing page and putting it in front of real users and seeing if people will, fake wish list your game, put in your email, whatever. It's so valuable and it's so important. And I like encourage everyone to find a way to do something like that because it does everything that we, and you could say, well, we don't have a game yet. We can have screenshots, make fake screenshots, pay an artist to make fake screenshots of what you think your game will look like in the art style. Like you gotta really, and this is a whole other kind of thing. Developers are very, especially indie types, are very uncomfortable like putting out like a sort of like fake thing, like their game doesn't exist yet and they're trying to represent it. Like that is absolutely critical. You have to get comfortable doing that. All the big companies are totally doing it. So I would strongly encourage you identify those key USPs, those key hooks, make a landing page, or a fake Steam page even that
yeah.
actually mimics the Steam page interface. Have people click a button, see if they're putting their email, what type of conversion rates. I mean, we're starting to do something even earlier, which is like we're calling kind of like emotional reaction testing, which is like we just describe the game casually. Like we'll just say this is our next game. It's not our next game. We don't know that. We're like, oh yeah, we're working on this, dual deck builder that's da 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 da. And we just look at people's faces, like we're just out and about, whatever, at a conference, at a thing, at an event. We identify people that this would, be at least closely enough represent our target or someone who might be
Yeah.
interested. And we just see like, are they like, oh, tell me more? Are they just like, oh, cool?
Yeah.
Like what is their emotional reaction? Does it pique their curiosity? Because you've got to have something that stands out from the crowd in such a competitive marketplace. So like there's all kinds of ways, and those are two specific examples I would strongly encourage people to start doing with their games. The game doesn't have to exist. You don't even have to know if you can build the game
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah.
People like, well, I can't make a landing page. I don't even know if I can make a, 2.5D RPG, da 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 da. It's like, it doesn't matter if you can make the game if no one's interested in it.
Yeah.
So first you have to, you got to see if it's something you can sell, then figure out if you can deliver on it, right?
Yeah. So
Um,
like you like you said, sell the sizzle, not the steak. And what I want to call it to too is, that idea and concept, it's nothing new. Like back in the, let's say, the entrepreneurial course industry, I don't know, one strategy that is extremely effective in that area and probably other verticals and things like that is going to be, if you're building a course, say, like, pitch the idea first, do a sign up page, like essentially a land up page, have a reduced cost and have people buy into it before it's even out there, and don't even make the course yet. Have an idea of what it's going to entail,
100%.
but that's it. But then, like, and there's people who've done it, and guess what? They got nothing. So they're like, all right, maybe this is an indicator. Maybe I need to position it different, communicate it differently, and then try it again. And it still doesn't work. At a certain point, hey, you got to stop and move on. And then there's people who've done it like, oh crap, I overbooked. Now I have to, but at least now I have the funds to make the damn course. So
100%.
lots,
And
yeah,
if you're uncomfortable taking payment, like there's other ways to like, I mean, you never want to ask people what they would do. You only like,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
true research, you want to like actually get people to commit, but like there's other ways around it. They don't give you necessarily as much confidence in the data. If someone's like, here's $300 off my credit card, that's high confidence, right? If someone's like, here's my email, okay, that's low confidence, but at
right,
least gives you something, right?
yep,
And that was advice. Maybe it was you that even gave it to me because I was working on a course a while back, and I was like, God, this is like months of work. And then I don't know if I talked to you or someone else, and I was like, duh, why am I going to build this course for months if I don't even know that people are going to want it? So
yeah.
like then I developed a landing page instead, and you can get data that way about. Basically, you're asking yourself, is it worth investing my time in this idea?
Yeah, and you know what's I know we gotta close here, but do you know what's even great about this idea too with landing pages is it takes a lot less effort than putting together a Kickstarter.
100%.
So
And you don't even have to, I mean, you don't even have to have most of a game. Luke and I have this really new concept, which is like it's a like bluffing, deduction, deception game that's kind of themed after money laundering. And, before we do any art or, any real investment, we want to start just like talking to people about it, doing a basic landing page, pay for some fake art. The game won't even look like that in the end, but make it look decent or interesting and in line with what we think is going to be there. And just like spend a few weeks instead of we like push this prototype and design further for months and months and months and then realize, it doesn't stand off enough in the
yeah,
crowd. People aren't interested in that. That's a huge loss for us as a business. So yeah, get scrappy. Landing pages. I think we should rename this episode to landing pages, landing pages, landing pages. But yeah,
that'll be the official subtitle that maybe I'll do something creative with, but we'll see.
but
Neil, it's been great. We're at time, but please, I mean, if people want to find out more about Aspens and other links, how to connect, drop some links for us, please.
yeah, absolutely. You can check out the Kickstarter. Late pledges are still live, or if you just want to see what we're doing, and then yeah, I'll drop the links. But yeah, at Ludivore Games on Instagram as well. You can kind of see what we're up to.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for having me. As always, it was a blast.
Yeah, same here. Same exact here. It's been great. Take care, Neil.
Later.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.